The maternity ward was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of calm that feels fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows, falling softly across the polished floor and the rows of doors leading to rooms where new lives had just begun. In one of those rooms sat a young woman who looked far older than her years, exhaustion carved into her face. She had given birth only hours earlier. Her hair was still unbrushed, her hands trembling slightly as she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket. This should have been a moment of peace, of wonder, of gentle happiness. Instead, tension clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. The door opened sharply, without the courtesy of a knock. The woman's mother-in-law entered with stiff steps and a tight expression, her eyes scanning the room not with tenderness but with judgment. From the first moment, it was clear she had not come to celebrate the newborn. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she looked at the bed, at the baby, and finally at her daughter-in-law. There was no greeting, no congratulations. Only a cold silence that made the room feel smaller. "You shouldn't be here," the older woman said at last, her voice low but cutting. "I've told you before, this family doesn't need troublemakers." The young mother blinked, confused and hurt. She tightened her hold on the baby, instinctively protective. She had imagined disagreements, perhaps even coldness, but not this. "Not now. Not here. I just gave birth," she said quietly. "This is my child." The mother-in-law scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as if brushing away something insignificant. "My son made a mistake," she replied. "And mistakes can be corrected. You should pack your things and leave. Don't make a scene." Nurses passed in the hallway outside, unaware of the drama unfolding behind the closed door. The young woman felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to spill. She was vulnerable, physically weak, emotionally raw, and yet she was being pushed as if she were an intruder. The words felt unreal, as if spoken in a nightmare. "I have nowhere to go," the daughter-in-law whispered. "Please, at least let me rest." But mercy was not forthcoming. The older woman stepped closer, her shadow falling across the bed. "Not my problem," she said sharply. "You rushed into something that wasn't meant for you. You're heading to the wrong station, girl. Life doesn't stop just because you had a baby." The cruelty of the words struck harder than any shout could have. The young mother stared at the woman before her, trying to reconcile this harsh figure with the grandmother her child deserved. Her hands shook now, not from weakness but from fear and disbelief. She wondered how things had come to this, how love had turned so quickly into rejection. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door opened again. This time, the sound was different. Slower. Deliberate. Both women turned their heads. A man stepped into the room, tall and unmistakable, his presence filling the space without a word being spoken. The mother-in-law froze mid-sentence, her mouth slightly open, her confidence draining from her face as if someone had pulled a plug. It was her son. He looked from his mother to his wife, then down at the newborn in his wife's arms. His expression hardened, not with anger alone, but with something deeper, disappointment. He had arrived later than planned, delayed by work and traffic, unaware that in his absence, lines had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. "What's going on?" he asked calmly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his true feelings. The mother-in-law straightened, attempting to regain control. "I was just explaining that this situation needs to be handled properly," she said quickly. "For the good of everyone. For the good of everyone," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. He stepped closer to his wife, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, relief and pain mingling in her gaze. "You told my wife to leave the hospital," he said. It was not a question. There was a pause, heavy and uncomfortable. The older woman opened her mouth, then closed it again. Words seemed to fail her for the first time. She had not expected this. She had assumed her authority would go unchallenged, as it always had. "This is my family," the man continued, his voice steady but firm. "This is my wife. This is my child. And you don't get to decide who belongs." The room felt suddenly different, as if the walls themselves were listening. The mother-in-law's face flushed, then paled. She looked around, searching for support that wasn't there. Her carefully constructed certainty crumbled under her son's unwavering gaze. "I was only trying to protect you," she muttered weakly. He shook his head. "No," he said. "You were trying to control us. And that stops now." Silence followed, thick and undeniable. The young mother felt tears finally spill down her cheeks, but these were different, relief mixed with exhaustion, the release of fear she had been holding in since the door first opened. She leaned into her husband's touch, feeling for the first time that she was not alone. The mother-in-law stood there, speechless, her earlier harshness replaced by stunned disbelief. She had come to assert her power and instead found herself stripped of it. Without another word, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing faintly down the corridor. When the door closed, the man exhaled slowly and looked down at his wife and child. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said softly. She shook her head, managing a small, tired smile. "You're here now," she replied. Outside, life in the hospital continued as usual, unaware of the quiet battle that had just been fought and won. Inside the room, a new family held together, fragile but determined, knowing that while the road ahead would not be easy, they were finally standing on the right track, together. The argument had been building long before the hospital room door ever opened. It lived in the sideways glances, the unanswered messages, the cold silences that followed every attempt at peace. By the time the young woman went into labor, she already knew her place in her husband's family was uncertain. Still, she clung to hope. A child, she believed, could soften even the hardest hearts. Holding her newborn in her arms, she wanted to believe that this tiny life might finally bring acceptance. That hope shattered the moment her mother-in-law stepped into the maternity ward. The older woman's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she entered, her posture rigid, her face set in an expression that suggested she had come not to congratulate, but to correct a mistake. She did not look at the baby with wonder. She did not smile. Instead, she scanned the room as though searching for something out of place, and then fixed her gaze on the woman in the bed. "So," she said flatly, folding her arms. "It finally happened." The young mother swallowed. She was weak, drained, her body still aching from hours of labor. She adjusted the blanket around her baby and forced a polite nod. "Yes," she replied softly. "She's here." The mother-in-law stepped closer, peering at the child with an almost clinical detachment. "A lot of trouble for something that could have been avoided," she muttered. The words landed like a slap. The young woman's heart raced as she tried to understand what she was hearing. "Avoided," she repeated, her voice trembling. "This is your grandchild." The older woman scoffed. "Blood alone doesn't make family," she snapped. "And you were never meant to be part of ours." The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. The young mother looked toward the door, half expecting someone to appear, a nurse or a doctor, anyone who could interrupt this cruelty. But no one came. She was alone with a woman who seemed determined to erase her. "I gave birth today," she said quietly. "I'm not leaving. This is where I'm supposed to be." The mother-in-law's lips curled into a tight smile. "You've always been confused about where you're supposed to be," she replied. "You rushed into this marriage, into this life. You're running to the wrong station, and now you want everyone else to change their route for you." Her voice rose with each word, sharp and unforgiving. "Pack your things. When my son gets here, I'll explain everything. He'll understand." The young woman's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Her hands tightened around the baby, her entire body instinctively shielding the child. She thought of the nights she had spent alone, of the constant effort to prove herself, of the love she had given so freely and received so sparingly in return. "I'm his wife," she said, finding strength she didn't know she had. "And this is his child. You can't just erase us." Before the mother-in-law could respond, the door opened. At first, neither woman spoke. The presence in the doorway shifted the energy in the room instantly. The man who entered stopped short, taking in the scene, the tense posture of his mother, the tears in his wife's eyes, the fragile bundle in her arms. "What's happening?" he asked. The mother-in-law turned quickly, relief flashing across her face. "Perfect timing," she said. "I was just telling her that this situation needs to be handled responsibly." His eyes never left his wife. He crossed the room in a few long strides and stood beside her bed, his hand gently resting on hers. "Handled how?" he asked. The older woman hesitated. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully now, "this marriage was rushed. Everyone knows that. And now there's a child involved. I think it's best if we slow things down, reconsider some choices." He looked at her, disbelief flickering across his face. "You told my wife to leave the hospital," he said, his voice low. She stiffened. I was trying to prevent further damage. Damage, he repeated. His voice grew steadier, colder. The only damage happening here is what you're doing right now. The mother-in-law opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She had expected support, agreement, at least hesitation. Instead, she was met with resolve. You don't get to decide my life, he continued. You don't get to decide who I love or who my family is. That was your role once. It isn't anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. The young mother felt something inside her loosen, a knot she had carried for months finally beginning to unravel. She looked up at her husband, seeing not just love, but certainty. I raised you better than this, the mother-in-law said weakly. He shook his head. You raised me to take responsibility, he replied. And this is me doing exactly that. She looked around the room as if searching for an escape, for a way to regain control. But there was none. Her power had evaporated the moment her son chose his own family over her authority. Without another word, she turned and left. The door closed softly behind her, but the impact of her exit lingered. The young woman finally let the tears fall. Her husband leaned down, pressing his forehead gently against hers. I'm so sorry, he whispered. You should never have had to face that alone. She shook her head, her voice breaking. I was so afraid you'd believe her. He pulled back slightly, meeting her eyes. There was never a moment I wouldn't choose you, he said. Both of you. Outside the window, the day moved on, unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place inside the hospital room. A line had been drawn, not in anger, but in clarity. A new family had been born, not just in blood, but in loyalty and choice. And though the road ahead promised challenges, it would no longer be defined by fear, but by the strength they found in standing together.